Let me just welcome you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We have a nice collection of some new faces. I'm so pleased to see some old friends. And I'm thrilled to introduce to those of you who don't know my husband, Scott, who is a political science professor with a specialty in the American presidency and media and politics and things that are so in evolution right now in a historical context. And so I asked Scott to sort of maybe help us see where we are today in context of a broader historical sweep. I thought it might be helpful and interesting for everybody. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Scotty.
Oh, I am so sorry. I
And
forgot
I'm
to
going to
turn
make you
my phone off.
co-host, honey.
I'm turning my phone off. Sorry. All right. Well, since the election of 2024, I don't know about you guys, but I've been struggling to figure out like what does this mean and how can I make sense of it? And I was really pleased to participate with Hartley Lachter's set of lectures, and I've heard him do some of those before as well. And one of the things I liked about it is that, Kabbalists we're trying to make sense of history and find some purpose in what's going on. And I would say that political scientists and social scientists oftentimes do the same thing. Historians do the same thing. And so this is obviously, the election just happened, but we've had Trump around for a long time. So I thought, one of the works that I go to a lot to understand where we are at politically in a deeper way, in a more structural way, if you would think of it that way, something that's not temporary. Um, I go to the work of a political scientist, Stephen Skowronek, and I'm going to show you some of the core of some of his most important insights about the nature of presidential time, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. Um, a lot of times we think about elections as in political sciences, is this a maintaining election? Is this an election that's somehow deviating? Or is it a realignment? And you may have heard of that term realignment in politics before. And and the idea that, there are some elections where the basic contours of American politics are just transformed, and thereafter, the rest of the political system is set to adjusting to those changes. That elections really matter. Um, Now, there are also those elections where there are immediate forces uh, that may mask themselves as being transformative, but are actually only short-term deviations, whether it's the Vietnam War or uh, or COVID-19, one might argue in this current election. A question mark that we can put out there is, was this a deviating election, or does this 24 election mark what had begun in 2016 as a more fundamental transformation of American politics? So sort of to try to help me answer that, I'm going to share my screen, and I have a little PowerPoint. This is a big mess right now, but let's see if we can find my PowerPoint that I just put here. Here it is. And hopefully this will help us get some purchase on this question about what's been happening, and open up a discussion perhaps with you guys. You can help me figure this out as well. All right, so when we think about the span of presidents, right, there are those that we think of as the great presidents and those that are the lousy presidents, right? Andrew Johnson, for example, James Buchanan, and the great presidents like my favorite, Lincoln or FDR, things like that. And, uh, the historians and the presidential and political scientists like me have ranked our presidents, and we kind of agree, you know, over time, there's a pretty widespread agreement over who are the great presidents. Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, FDR, Theodore Roosevelt, Eisenhower's there, Truman, Jefferson. You can see this. This is from C-SPAN's a survey of all of these historians and political scientists, and we do it every year. But look at Lincoln's always number one, Washington's always number two, Roosevelt's always number three, TR is always number four. We don't change a lot. And when I think about those great presidents, they usually take office after what we might call a realignment, a fundamental transformation in our politics, marked by some critical election. And what Stephen Skowronek does is he says, there's a way in which uh, presidents there's a cycle of presidential time that recurs throughout our politics, over and over and over again. And usually what happens, and we'll start with this lower right-hand cell here. In at a moment of transformation, a president like Lincoln or Washington before it, right? Obviously Washington or FDR. Skowronek puts Reagan here as well, and I'll explain why. Takes office, and there's a broad warrant for them to uh, do transformative things, to reconstruct our politics. Usually they come into power opposed to a weak regime. So let's take Reagan coming into power upon the shoals of a like weakening liberal regime that began with great strength under FDR. When Carter's presiding over that declined regime, he's doing a job of trying to manage a politics that he's got to try to continue and try to expand for the Democratic Party in that case. But the argument for the power of that liberal regime has lost its appeal for so much of America that it opens the door for a transformative leader to take power in a huge election, landslide election, and enter into authority and to remake American politics in a very different way. We call these presidents, the politics. They're in, according to Skowronek, in this position of the politics of Reconstruction, which each of these cells describes an opportunity, a structural opportunity for presidents to wield power. In the politics of Reconstruction, presidents have a tremendous opportunity to really do huge things. So all of the great presidents come into power in this position, right? Take Jefferson in the election of 1800, or Lincoln in the election of 1860, or FDR in 1932, or Reagan in 1980, just to be four of those. When they're succeeded, their next president that follows them is tasked with continuing their project, right? Let's take the Reagan example, continuing on with that. And we'll talk about Bush, Daddy Bush, I like to call him, Bush 1, comes into authority, right? He's as vice president after 2 terms of Reagan, where he make the argument that Reagan shifted our politics from a focus on how government, the national government's role in growing, would do more for different groups, would expand its welfare state programs, would expand its national security establishment, and then here comes Reagan and says, government is no longer right. We need to reduce the size of government. And until Reagan became president in 1981, when he assumed the presidency in that campaign in 1980, that was a minority position. And now all of a sudden, uh, starting with Reagan, that becomes the majority position. Now, Bush comes into office and he's tasked with trying to continue that. He's affiliated with a powerful regime. And his job, as all presidents in that position are, is to carry on the agenda of the reconstructive president that preceded them. Now, the challenge, this is a very difficult position for a president to be in because every single president comes into office and they want to make their mark. They, you know, Bush did not want to be Reagan, and he couldn't be Reagan. He needed to be Bush. And so every president comes into power. Skowronek writes that the presidency is fundamentally an order-shattering institution, that every president needs to come into authority and try to do something different and new to leave their stamp on it. But at the same time, the affiliated uh, uh, presidents have to somehow continue the work of the regime that they're a part of. In this case, George H.W. Bush having to continue the work of the Reagan presidency. And it's very challenging. Now, a lot of times these affiliated uh, presidents are one-term presidents, like George H.W. Bush. The third part of this cycle that recurs again, this is something that happens over and over again. You have the politics of Reconstruction, then you have continuing on affiliated presidents who are in this position of they have to articulate and extend the project of that original reconstructive president, but they don't have the same kind of warrant for this transformation. They're coming into power midstream, so to speak. And then you get this third piece, which is uh, the president that has to preside over a weak regime. 15, 20 years later, after the original transformation, the public, the political system has forgotten all of the reasons why they needed to reconstruct American politics along the lines of the original transformative leader, Reagan. And now we're 20 years into it, 25 years, maybe 30 years into it, and you've got a president that has got to somehow remind people of why the original transformative project is still relevant when it isn't. It's just not relevant. New problems have sprouted up, new issues have emerged, and in this position, a late term affiliate with a regime, you're trying to manage basically the job that these presidents have is to George W. Bush. Um, some people argue it was Donald Trump in 2016, that their job is to basically somehow manage uh, all of the different coalitional partners, the evangelical Christians, the corporate business leaders, rural voters, to somehow find policy issues, policies that will meet their needs and keep them happy. But having an overarching transformative vision doesn't seem to work anymore. And these presidents basically preside over the disarray and ultimately failure of that regime, which opens up the door for a new leader to come in and to remake American politics. People want some kind of new leadership to address the issues of the day. And this begins the whole cycle again into the politics of Reconstruction. And if you're wondering about this politics of preemption, this is a very unusual thing, right? In terms of when we look at democracies worldwide, um, presidential democracies have an opportunity for a president to come into power from an opposition position to the majority party, right? If we're having an election in Israel, right, um, you've got to have the majority first before you can become prime minister. But in the United States, you can be Barack Obama, Stephen Skronik argues, coming into authority in a time when the Reagan regime is now weak, but not yet done. And to somehow take advantage, in this case, of a tremendous economic collapse, the housing crisis of 2008, um, and take authority. These presidents preempt the 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 dominant regime from the opposition, and they are usually si signaling to us the tremendous weakness of that dominant regime, that it is ripe for transformation, and yet they're not yet in that position. So oftentimes these preemptive presidents can become presidents for 2 terms. Nixon is my favorite one, only because I'm just fascinated with how he came into power on the shoals of the divisions in the Democratic Party in 1968 over the Vietnam War. After a huge transformative victory in 1964, landslide victory, I should say, of LBJ. 4 years later, here comes Nixon, barely squeaking into the White House because the Democratic Party is split over the deep passions over Vietnam. But that doesn't mean that Nixon is in a position to be, Reconstruction. In 1968, he wins by a hair. In 1972, he wins by a landslide. Um, but he's still a preemptive president. It would take Carter's disjunctive leadership of the Democratic regime to lead to Reagan's Reconstruction. Okay, so this is the cycle, and I wanted to just run through that argument with you. All right, here are some of our Reconstructive presidents. Uh, the Reconstructive presidents, there's not a lot of them. Each one of them inaugurates a brand new way of thinking about politics. A Almost always there's a new party. If it's not a new party, it's a wholesale transformation of the political party that these presidents are leading. Um, Reagan's Republican Party was a lot different than Nixon's and Eisenhower's Republican Party. FDR's Democratic Party was a lot different than Jefferson's or Jackson's or any of the uh, or Wilson's uh, uh, Democratic Party. Lincoln basically invented the Republican Party. It was a minor party until Lincoln was president. Um, so we can go on and on, but each one of these inaugurates that cycle by transforming not just American politics, but their entire political party, bringing a new dominant majority coalition, and taking new policies. And by the way, this is really important. It's not just that they win a big election, it's that they institutionalize their project in policy and changing the the nature of American government. Um, think about the impact that each of these presidents had on the court, on the way that the presidency operated, on the policies that became institutionalized. I think of FDR and Social Security, um, and all of the other programs that he inaugurated. Um, so that's really important to consider. So we're not just talking about elections, we're talking about an entire regime that includes transformation of American politics. The supporting affiliates, these are just some of them, and I just wanted to highlight that when Skoronic does this, he's not saying that they have to come one after the other, but during a period of time when the regime still is relevant and powerful, subsequent presidents affiliated with that original transformative regime become uh, uh, tasked with the job of articulating. So Truman came right after FDR, of course, JFK, LBJ, Bush won. We could talk about any of these when I finish. I'll open it all up to you. Um, the disjunctive presidents are typically what we think of as the failures, right? Franklin Pierce after Lincoln, and before Lincoln, at the end of Jacksonian period, Rutherford B. Hayes at the end of Lincoln, Jimmy Carter at the end of the FDR regime. And Skowronek wants to place Trump in 2016 after that election as the disjunctive president that assumes authority over the old and decrepit Reagan regime, the falling apart of that conservative regime. Um, just food for thought. I put a question mark there because I'm going to raise some issues with his placement of Trump in that position. The preemptive regime challengers are, as I said, sort of the canary in the proverbial coal mine uh, for the powerful regime. The regime that's in power can only be preempted if it has some area of weakness that is undermining of its own authority and power. And so Nixon, as I mentioned, came in when the Democratic Party was split. It was split not only over the Vietnam War, which was the most important split in 1968, but there was a change in the Democratic Party from the 1950s and 60s, from even JFK. By the end of the 1960s, movement politics from the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the the early environmental movement, um, was a big challenge to the establishment Democratic Party. Um, the Vietnam War only highlighted those fissures within the Democratic Party and opened up an opportunity for Nixon. But notice what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the Democratic Party, not the Nixon regime, the Democratic Party's failure. So Clinton, who emerged in the middle of the Reagan regime, came into authority in 1992, power in 1992, as a third way Democrat. Remember, he won by less than a majority of the popular vote, 45% of the popular vote. Ross Perot was ran a third party candidacy, won 19% of the popular vote that year. Um, Most people say he took those votes away from George Bush and made him a one-term president. But Clinton was also splitting the Republican Party by running towards the middle and some say even to the more conservative center. He saw an opportunity to take advantage of uh, the uh, the the uh, the weakening of the Reagan regime. Obama also emerged as a kind of preemptive president after the 2008 uh, economic collapse. The question is whether Biden was also a preemptive president because of the COVID epidemic and pandemic, and because of the extreme ex extreme divisions that surrounded the Trump 2016 disjunctive president, and that Biden came into authority. Now, someone might have said, well, there's a disjunctive president, Trump, and then here comes Biden with a broadened Democratic party coalition, um, thinking about the new elements in the Democratic Party on the progressive left and uniting them with the old, more stalwart Democrats in the middle, center left, and seeking to create a broader tent, inaugurating new policies like expanding the Affordable Care Act and things like that, that maybe Biden was a transformative, reconstructive president and not a preemptive president. So that's why I have a question mark next to his name. Julia Azari, who's a friend of mine and a great political scientist. And I know it's hard to read this, but I'll just say that when you when she starts to think about Trump in 2017, 18, and she's starting to write about his place in political time, looking at this Skoronic model, she wants to argue that actually he could fit in almost any position. Is he reconstructive? Is he in the politics of articulation? Is he a mid, is he an affiliate of a powerful regime, or is he a preemptive president interrupting already a a Democratic Party Obama regime, perhaps? It's when we see the classic characteristics of the reconstructive. Let's start with that one. Because, and I bring this up because the Trump team right now is saying they have a mandate in 2024 that this is by the way, they will say they won in 2020 and that this is just confirmation of this, that election was stolen. We know that that's not the case. There's no factual evidence at all. In fact, just the opposite. Factual evidence says it wasn't stolen, that Biden handily won that. But their argument is that they represent the future of America, that this is a mandate for change, that their coalition, Make America Great Again, and their effort to deconstruct American government, to tear apart the deep state, to reinvent America's role in the international system, the post-war leadership role that America had, that all of that is warranted given his position as a reconstruction, right? So the classic characteristics, however, are that reconstructive presidents build institutions. Um, there's not a lot of evidence that Trump in 2016 to 2017 to 21 did anything to build any new institutions. He took apart some institutions. He damaged the Department of State, for example, and other major institutions of American government. He might have transformed the Supreme Court with his, I would say that would be the closest he might have come to transforming an institution. Um, he certainly engaged in major party building. The Republican Party before Trump and after Trump are two different things, right? Everybody would say, and in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party, there's no nobody is saying that that Trump definitely transformed the Republican Party. It is his party. And that's common, by the way. Reagan transformed the Republican Party. FDR transformed the Democratic Party. Jefferson transformed the Republican Democratic Party. So these transformative reconstructive presidents do that. Um, uh, Reconstructive presidents violate norms, right? We know that Trump did a lot of that. FDR, when he took the nomination in person at the Democratic Party National Convention, that was brand new. Nobody ever did that. That was when he started to have regular fireside chats on the radio with the American public to connect the American public directly to the presidency. That was a very different approach. When he expanded the authority of the presidency with a huge range of executive orders and national policies that reached into everybody's life, those were shifts in norms. And he said, it was time to change those norms. Well, Trump too has violated a whole set of norms that we can talk about when I open up for discussion. Um, and he's definitely shifted the terms of national policy debate. One would say that he might have even exploded the idea of a policy debate, that we don't even have a policy debate anymore. It's just about, whether, and so all of these things might have placed him in this politics of Reconstruction, but he was also, um, in some ways, in his attacks on the deep state and his decided antipathy to powerful national governance, um, uh, following along the lines of the Reagan assault on the power and the expansiveness of the federal government. So we could place him in the politics of articulation. Uh, in terms of preemption, um, is he opposed to a powerful regime? Is he offering a different kind of politics, right? When Trump emerged as the nominee of the Republican Party did not want him to be the nominee. Certainly not in 2016. And how he captured the nomination again in 2024 was again by running as an outsider who was going to split the Republican Party uh, and uh, make claims uh, that were sort of seemed like reconstructive, transformational claims, but really relied on his own character and critique of the other party, of the Democratic Party in this case. And here, we would put Andrew Johnson, Nixon, Clinton, and all three of these were impeached. Nixon would have been impeached, right? He was never formally impeached because he resigned before the vote on impeachment took place in the House of Representatives. And certainly Trump was impeached. So there's an argument for him to be in preemption. So what Azaria argues is that Azari, excuse me, Julia, is that there's a scrambling of the political time model that that Stephen Skowronek puts forward. And to understand why that occurs, we have to look at excuse me, uh, what a second part, an often overlooked part of Stephen Skowronek's overarching view of the role of the presidency in time, which is secular time. These are trends that happen in linear time that have changed the way we do business, so to speak, politically over time. And therefore affect the cycle that I was just talking about, the recurrent cycle between reconstruction, uh, articulation, disjunction, interrupted by preemption. That's the cycle that gets repeated over and over again. But secular time are long-term trends that have continued throughout and altered the very landscape upon which we see these transformations. And there are a number of important ones to point to, which I'll go through and why they're relevant here to thinking about 2024. The First of all, the modern state that we know and rail against, the government, that my students will say the government, not knowing that we have many forms of government, um, is is was developed in the 1930s and 40s. The national bureaucracies, the civil service reform, the expansive, independent agencies like the FDA and the FCC and um, Social Security Administration, the National Security Council, all of these emerged and really matter in terms of the capacity of a president to transform our politics, because these are institutions that are staffed up to the gills with professionals with lots of experience who are rooted in those institutional uh, uh, commitments, uh, and care about their institution and want to protect it. So the longer we go, and I'll come back to the slide in 1 minute, right? In the beginning, the whole world John Locke wrote was like America, tabula rasa. When Jefferson assumed office, he did not have to do a lot to dismantle the Federalist policies because there wasn't a lot of government to dismantle. But now the whole world is like Tokyo. This is a picture of Tokyo, in case you didn't know. Um, and if you want to rebuild something in Tokyo, you've got to knock something down. And it ain't so easy to knock all these buildings down to build something new, right? We are, as Skowronek will say, the modern state has resulted in the thickening of American institutional politics, which makes it much harder for a transformative reconstructive president, even when the public wants them to be successful. Reagan had a very difficult time dismantling the welfare state. He came into office saying that he was going to do that. When he started in on Social Security, that was bad news for him, and he had to back off that really quickly and appoint a presidential commission, bipartisan commission, to figure out what to do. His effectiveness at reducing the size of the government was zero. In fact, the federal government expanded under Reagan, and with resulting huge levels of deficits and the skyrocketing of debt, because he cut taxes and government continued to expand in its role, particularly the military establishment. The second big change that has happened over time is our political parties. Our political parties used to be able to select their own candidates. They were organizations with some heft and some, right? I'm talking about the people behind the scenes. I'm not talking about the people in office like, uh, like the vice president and the majority leader and people like that. I'm talking about the party leaders in each of the states, and they lost power, particularly in the 1960s, to a push to democratize American politics and to allow the people to choose their own nominees. We moved from party-centered campaigns to candidate-centered campaigns. The political parties now exist in large part to support candidates, but the candidates call the shots. The candidates decide the themes. The candidates choose their coalitions. Um, it is the Trump Republican Party instead of Trump being part of the Republican Party. And what Julia Azari points out is that we have the unfortunate circumstance of having very weak political parties institutionally with extreme levels of partisanship among the public. So much so that we are deeply polarized in American politics. So these sets of transformations have been occurring over a long period of time, starting at the end of World War II, and have reached a heightened level of uh, uh, right now, right? We have a very weak set of political parties. They can't even choose their own candidates. Um, and yet people are driven by partisanship so much so that they have motivated reasoning and who they want to vote for. They select their own, right, which gets me into the last couple things, which is our technology, our media are absolutely transformed. It was not that long ago, in my view, 30, 40 years ago, where we had several different networks that people kind of agreed on the facts of the news. The news journalism was a profession that was respected. And today we exist in a world of social media. And in fact, I would say that since 2020, the media landscape has been radically transformed just in the last 4 years. The 2024 election was the first podcast election, and that should tell you something. Axios has this wonderful piece where they identified 12 different media groups out there. People are getting, whether you're getting your news from Joe Rogan or Call Me Daddy or where, which social media, whether you're right, the young generation are 18 to 24-year-olds are the children of 8chan and 4chan, which there's a tremendous amount of hate and anti-Semitism and racism and misogyny out there. So this kind of transformed media where we're disaggregated and fractured, where there's no one center of political information, and there's a tremendous opportunity for misinformation and disinformation from foreign actors and domestic actors, is also a massive change in our politics that has occurred in large part since 2004, 5, 6, when we first started getting the Facebook. 2008 was the first Facebook election. You think about that, and where we're at right now. The last piece is that our presidents are so much stronger than they have ever been, starting with World War II, with FDR really, and on. Um, and really, in some ways, the story of uh, American politics is a story of executive aggrandizement. The presidents have over and over again expanded their authority, and we want that, right? When there's a crisis, an economic crisis, an international crisis, Americans cry out for presidential leadership. They don't look for congressional leadership. And presidents in those moments usually grab new forms of power and authority, and they're not likely to give that up ever again. Once that's been there, right? I'll give you a great example. Obama, when he ran for president, said he would never, ever. He was very critical of George W. Bush for running wiretaps, illegal surveillance. It wasn't really wiretaps on cell phone records of Americans without a warrant from the court, a secret foreign intelligence surveillance uh, court. Obama was tremendously critical of that. And then he got into power and he realized this is very valuable to me as that I can do this. And actually, the NSA continued to do it under Obama and expanded those programs as well. So presidents are very, very powerful. And it doesn't help that because of weak parties and strong partisanship, our Congress is basically seen as the broken branch. It is weak and unable to mount a successful check on executive authority. And in fact, Congress typically asks the president to take on new tasks. They give them broad warrants of authority. Think about the Obamacare program. The the Congress passed this massive new guarantee of health care, and then said the executive branch, you design it. You decide how to create these managed care networks, and you decide how to. All of that was for the executive branch to enforce and to create. And so, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you're expanding the authority of the presidency. All of this changes, right? How we think about things, right? We don't like our political parties, right? This is the percentage of Americans that have an unfavorable view of both the political parties. Um, we're growing in our distaste for that. Young people are not registering for either the Democrats or Republicans as much as they are as independents or as declined to state. Um, and our trust in government is historically low, and it's been down there for a long time. So when we talk about transforming American politics and the role of the presidency in a moment of turmoil to assume a reconstructive role, to change our politics, to alter it in a way that the public is desiring. Their capacity to do so is at once expanded, executive aggrandizement, and extremely limited, the crowded nature of the executive branch, national government, independent agencies, and the weakness of political parties institutionally for carrying out the agenda of any president. Presidential authority is at its highest. We've had more, right, one way to think about it is the use of executive orders and independent, right? Presidents come into office and they would like to do legislative things. But more and more so, presidents issue executive orders, which are these independent uh, uh, actions that presidents can take, presidential directives, president executive orders. In the international realm, presidents don't negotiate treaties so much anymore as create executive agreements, which they don't need Senate confirmation for. They just, but which have the force of international law as long as they remain in place. Now, of course, the problem with that is with both with executive orders, which are domestic level, and executive agreements, is that the next president can come into office and reverse those things. So, where does this leave us? Was Trump's 2024 win a signal that the 16 election was the beginning of a transformation? Um, well, Julia Azari and Steven Skowronek argue that we might be in a position now where the presidential cycle is so attenuated that we're constantly in a politics of disjunction. We go back and forth from preemption and disjunction, that no president ever can have the kind of power and authority that certainly FDR had, or that Reagan was able to manage. So here's some signs that that may be the case. First of all, 2024, as much as the Trump people are liking to call this a massive, uh, landslide, it was less than 2% in the popular vote. Now, obviously, we're talking about blue states having large majorities for Kamala Harris and et cetera, et cetera. But uh, the truth is that the look at Congress. Congress virtually is unchanged. Right now, it's about 221 to 214 for the Republicans. That's where it was pretty much before the election by one or two members of the House. That doesn't sound like a transformative landslide victory. The Senate is closely divided, 53 to 47. It's pretty big, but the Democrats held on to some closely contested seats in the Senate, but that there was thought that they might lose them. Um, at the same time, there are some signs that there are transformations underfoot, right? Latino voters, 43%. Some exit polls say 46%. And we will not know, by the way. The exit polls, and this is a shout out to my colleagues who pointed this out to me about a week ago. Exit polling is notoriously unreliable. People leave, they vote, they come out of the voting booth, and then they're asked questions, and they don't necessarily remember their vote, or they don't tell you accurately. So we will not know until we get for a few more weeks till we get the actual totals from the Census Bureau about how people actually voted and more accurate level voting. But the Latino voters, according to this AP poll, 43% went for Trump, and particularly younger Latino voters, um, both male and female. Now you might say, well, Kamala Harris still won a majority. Absolutely, but this is a smaller percentage of Latino voters, and we've been talking about that for a while, so I know you're familiar with that. Young voters, 47% of younger voters, particularly young male voters under 45 years old, voted for Trump. That was up from 40% in 2020. And lower income voters continue to trend towards Trump. This is the first time that he actually won those votes outright in 2024. He didn't win them in 2020. This is usually, so it's interesting. A couple things to sort of take note about this. A lot of people are talking about, well, 2020, I'm going to stop sharing my uh, uh, slides. A lot of people said, there are a couple of reversals that are really kind of interesting that I've noticed. The Democratic Party is the biggest line between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party is in education. Highly educated people with college degrees and older went for Kamala Harris in large numbers. And less educated people tend to vote for Trump. And this is affecting racial minorities as well, who tend to have lower levels of education in the aggregate. And they're voting increasingly, as we can see, Latinos um, for Trump, lower income voters for Trump, younger voters for Trump increasingly. I'm not saying those are majorities, but um, and so that's a big thing. The other thing about that is interesting that it used to be that high turnout elections, and this was by all means looks like it was another high turnout election where it wasn't quite as high turnout as 2020, but very high, higher than 2016. Um, and um, it used to be that high turnout elections were beneficial to the Democratic Party, which has a large number of a lot of their coalition were lower propensity voters, less educated, lower income, racial minorities, who tend to vote more so in presidential elections and less so in midterm elections. Well, now it looks like that has maybe flipped, that the Democrats are going to do better in the midterm elections when highly educated voters vote, when upper income voters vote, the Democratic Party will benefit from less educated white and less educated minority voters. Some are less likely to vote in those midterm elections. So, are we in a transformative period? My verdict is I don't think so, but I do think that maybe we're in a position right now where transformation is decreasingly possible. That no matter who gets elected president, despite the irony that the presidency is so much more powerful today than it was even 10 years ago, that they're less capable of transforming our politics in an institutional way that will last over a long period of time. And now I'll open it up to questions. Ria, please. You have to unmute yourself.
Hi. Uh,
Hello.
I wanted to ask a couple of things. This was
Yeah,
fascinating, absolutely fantastic. So, our first president, Washington, in a sense, was a transformative president. He was offered the kingship. He
right.
turned it down because the previous leader was King George, who was mad, not mad, not angry, but mad. And so, I mean, this is really, it fits in a sense, if you look at its leadership and eliminate the word president. And then during the height of the power of the party, I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, and it was the party boss. If you were friendly with the party boss and you had a business and you needed the city to do some things that were favorable to your business, you went to the party boss and you were friends with the party boss. And so have they looked at all at the idea of Trump presenting himself as the party boss, and that Trump, can help you, Scott, even though you are just this one person in California. But there's that personal kind of connection that people are pulled into. It's a psychological type of thing. So, anyway, this is wow, what a overview. Thanks.
Yes, and it is true. Actually, since FDR, presidents have inaugurated this idea that the policies that they create, like Social Security, are their policies. And that's a way that they connect to different groups of voters. In times where you're in a disjunctive time, when a president is trying to manage the different elements of his coalition, uh, they oftentimes will throw out new policies, smaller policies that benefit this group or this one or that one. And it's that kind of connection. You're right that the party boss, in some ways, restrained the authority of the president because they were the intermediary that the president sort of worked with. Um, but the party was the one that sort of created those connections with the voters. And now it's the candidate and the president. And that's been accelerating since FDR. There's some wonderful work on that by one of my former teachers, Sid Milkis, who I just really love.
Scott, uh,
Yes.
when Nixon ran in '68, one of his strengths was that he flipped the Southern Democrats, or the Dixiecrats, from Democrats to Republicans. And that was the first time I heard the word, also the silent majority.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what Nixon did was very similar to what Trump did. He flipped that lower income person, the forgotten American, the silent majority. I think part of it was also, if you look at the Democrat or the election results, it was very geographical. The Democrats took all the coastal states, both in the Pacific and the Atlantic, but almost everything else was red. And I think, there's something about, they talk about coastal elite, college educated. There's something there. It might have been, I always felt the Democrats ran that identity politics for years and years. And I think people just got tired of it. And I think that was one of the pills of Trump. And the last thing, I don't want to get the times that we live in seems a lot like the times before slavery, like the 1830s through 1860s, that there seems to be divisions in the country that cannot be settled. Do you see that right now? Even the types of guys who are running for president are similar. One-term presidents, and the next guy comes in, doesn't seem to really solve the problem.
First of all, I think everything you said is absolutely true, but I do want to caution us that to say that, one of the features of the antebellum period was, we were so closely competitive, the
Right.
Whigs and the Democrats in every place all over the country. And I think that, beneath the 312 to, electoral college votes and the picture of the map that's red in the middle and blue on the edges, um, honestly, most of it's just purple, right? And just think about California. There are a lot of Republicans in California, right? I mean, obviously it's not even close to a majority, but it's not, Kamala Harris lost 8 percentage points of support in the state of California uh, between 2020 and now. And so the other thing I didn't even mention, so I agree with everything you're saying, and I do think we are in that place. And my hope is that there are policy areas which have been deeply politicized, but which in many ways are naturally available for cross-partisan coalition building. I think about environment and energy independence, right? That there's a lot of opportunity there for people to sort of support across, if it wasn't so politicized, and that's the job of the politicians to try to find that area. And that's just one. I think immigration policy, believe it or not, as an opportunity, there's an opportunity there for bipartisanship or cross-partisanship, but we have to change the nature of our party politics right now. And that's got to get toned down. And that's going to be, I have no idea how to do that, but I do think that's possible. I just don't know how to get there.
Do you see a third party emerging?
Well, the problem with we certainly could do it, but the problem is because our electoral system is such that we have single member districts, winner take all elections. And those elections, like the electoral college, like our House elections, um, almost by law, like there's a law in political science called Duverger's law. We don't have a lot of laws in political science. That's a law that when you have political system like that, you get two parties. We'd have to move to a parliamentary system or a different way of voting, maybe. But right now, I can't see it happening. Rabbi Marcia, do we have a time for one or two more questions, or if there are people, or should we?
We do
Okay.
have, if anyone has, I guess one question I have for you is, um, the personality driven nature of Trump's appeal. Is is that sustainable beyond him? Among his acolytes. Is this sort of really just an exceptional figure in human history? I do wonder about that.
Well, I want to say two things about that. One is when you have very weak political party institutions and strong partisanship, it's going to have to rely on the personality of the leaders, plural. But in this case, Trump. And I want to go back to Obama as a very similar figure for the Democratic Party in a sense, uh, putting aside all of how I feel about their policy differences, but they were charismatic and powerful figures. And one of the big critiques of Obama's, he did very little to build the Democratic Party below the level of the presidency. Um, and, a lot of people are saying that, Trump, he might have won this election, but he didn't usher in a clear majority for the Republicans in the House. And by the way, Mike Johnson is going to have a lot of hard work before him to try to hold together a very fractious majority. Once the initial excitement of we're all behind Trump goes, and they start to talk about specific policies, budget, things like that, they're not going to be, it's going to be hard to hold them together. So yes, I do think it's the force of the personality, but I do think there's something structural about our politics right now that elevates, like Ria was saying, the role of that individual at the national level. And maybe that's one of the reasons why Kamala Harris is uh, appealing as she was to many Democrats, that she didn't have that uh, same kind of level appeal as someone like an Obama or as a Trump.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for teaching today. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure I'm not the only person on this Zoom call that has really, been grappling with what it all means and how we, uh, you know, keep moving on and trying to build instead of feeling despondent. It was good to see it in context of history, and you know a lot, and I really appreciate you sharing that with us today. And I'm so happy that all of you are here. It great to learn together. And I want to wish everybody a very happy Thanksgiving. And I want to let you know that our next scholar, beginning next week, is Rabbi Micah Becker Klein.
Mm.
He's trained in the Reconstructionist movement, but a very um, just a great musician, but his real passion is food. He is a beer brewer and a coffee roaster and a scholar on all of that. And so we're going to have a 3 session um, course on Jews and food. And he's going to talk about not only, sort of biblical connections, but historical connections and practical connections to how many of our favorite, well, drinks and things that we eat sort of were moved out worldwide because of Jews. And so I hope you'll join us for that and more to come. Want to wish you all just a very, very good week. Take care of yourself. As Scott said to me, self-care now is more important than ever before for every one of us. And so may you all be well. And as we, keep the hope. Good to see you, Jerry and Linda. I'm so glad you came, and thank you, Rosalie. Take
Thank
care.
you, everybody, for coming. And I do want to say one last thing, which is that I don't really know what this means exactly, but this is how I'm starting to think about it, these things. So if you guys have some ideas you want to share with me, please, Marcia, you can share my email,
Okay.
sspitzer@Fullerton. Okay, thank you so much
Yeah.
for all the nice words of encouragement in the chat.